There's a lot of rage being displayed by many of my fellow cisgender white men.
Imagine if a comparable statement had been made about any other group. There's a lot of petulant whining on display from gender nonconforming people. There's a lot of crime on display from black people. Or there's a lot of anti-Semitism on display from Muslims. Would Steve consider any of those statements bigoted? And if so, why did he not consider his statement bigoted? Keep that in mind, because I'll be referring back to it in a minute.
You see it on a daily basis on the internet. You saw it during this most recent U.S. presidential campaign.
I believe vote Trump, damn it! You voted Trump! You voted Trump! Oh, we disrespected.
And I suppose I could answer that rage with some of my own.
Fuck the men's rights movement!
But when I really think about it, it's not so much that I'm mad at them, it's that I feel sorry for them.
Forgive me for not taking your condescending pity at face value, because if that last clip I edited in is anything to go by, your sympathy is actually just a facade that you can use to hide your unbridled rage. Which I'd imagine you're doing, because if you got angry in this video, you would be an angry cis white male. Wouldn't that be ironic in a video where you're addressing angry cis white males?
Here are 5 sad things about angry white men. Number 1, they're ignorant.
Hello, blanket statement. I wonder why it is Steve used angry for this video when he means, or at least presumably means, bigoted, or sexist, or racist. Anger isn't a permanent or even consistent state of being. A person doesn't wake up as an angry white man. Who specifically are you referring to?
In the mid-18th century, the English poet Thomas Gray wrote, "Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise." Gray was reflecting wistfully on the innocence of youth, but in a different context, he could easily have been describing the angry white men who formed the backbone of Donald Trump's base of support during this year's U.S. presidential election.
Ah, that's what you meant when you said angry, ignorant white men. You meant Trump supporters. Because no other factors were at play when someone decided to vote for Trump. Well, I hate the blacks, and the gays, and those gender fluid whatever people. So you know what? I'm going to vote for Trump. That sounds like my candidate of choice. That's what Steve thinks was going through the head of most Trump supporters.
It's not just what these men don't know that makes it sad, it's what they are happy to not know.
The man who filters his exposure to ideas he dislikes through disabling ratings, culling his comments, and subscribing to a blockbot is about to explain why other people are wrong for being blissfully ignorant about things.
They are extremely skeptical of science, except when they perceive it to reinforce their pre-existing biases. They care little to nothing about the experiences of people different than they are. Their knowledge of history is narrow, shallow, and warped by the narratives of conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, all those angry white men are just barely sentient Neanderthals, angrily swinging their clubs at anything they're not familiar with. Whereas you, and people like you, are the empathetic enlightened who have transcended their biases and reached objectivity. You do consider yourself an activist, right? Can you see how this approach to activism isn't compelling, and how it might have played a role in Hillary's defeat?
Having said all that, it almost goes without saying that, number 2, they're easily led, easily and often. Right-wing politicians and pundits are constantly manipulating white male voters with narratives about liberals coming to take their guns, immigrants stealing their jobs, labor unions destroying industry, or welfare recipients bleeding their country dry.
And yet you, the person who thinks the United States is a rape culture, the person who thinks that the inclusion of men on anti-sexual harassment signs is somehow damaging to equality, the one who thinks you can't be racist or sexist towards whites or men, you think you've not been fed any lines. You think you've not been led. You're a free, independent thinker, who's only incidentally an ideologue.
Year after year, the fears and prejudices of these men are used to persuade them to vote against not just the common interest of the country, but against the interests of themselves and their families.
If you want to talk about unjustified fear, how about all the people who are referring to Trump as if he's the second coming of Hitler? As if in his first 100 days he's going to start exterminating the Jews or something. I mean, be realistic. We're not even going to have the death camps ready until his third term.
And why? Why are they so easily led? Well, in addition to their aforementioned ignorance, there's also the fact that, number 3, they're insecure.
I think this might be another instance of the pot calling the kettle black.
For generations, white men have been told that women's liberation, racial equality, LGBTQ equality, and multiculturalism are going to destroy their way of life.
And it will, won't it? To be clear, that's not my position, that's your position, because you think we live in a white supremacist patriarchal rape culture. So yes, a deviation from that would change their way of life. You frame it as if equality for minority groups is not going to change these people's way of life, but in reality it will, and you just want them to accept it. But even more in reality, we don't live in a white supremacist patriarchal rape culture. And while there are, and always will be, people who advocate against equality for all groups, that is not the norm and is not the significant voice you think it is.
They've been asked rhetorical questions like, why is there no White History Month? Or why is it that the only group of people not allowed to be proud of who they are white people? Or why is it that no one cares when men are abused? Or why don't they appreciate all that we've done for them? Despite belonging to perhaps the most privileged class of people that has ever lived.
And now I refer you back to the beginning of this video where Steve made a comment directed at white men that he would consider racist or sexist had it been directed at any other group or combination of groups. He holds whites and men to a separate standard than he holds anyone else, and he thinks that's equality. White men have the privilege of being given lesser consideration. Do you see how this line of reasoning might elicit a negative response, and how it's not convincing?
White men have been convinced that they are about to lose everything. And, number 4, they're afraid.
Point 4 is a rehash of things you've already said throughout the rest of this video, so I'm going to skip it and move on to point 5.
They're being left behind, and that is sad. It's not sad that their racism is being left behind, or their xenophobia, their religious intolerance, their homophobia, their transphobia, their misogyny, their petulant, self-centered, victim-playing worldview.
Does that count as an appropriation of shitlord culture? Steve, you should be ashamed of yourself. Humanity is not leaving any of those things or their equivalents behind. Those are coming with us for the foreseeable future. And I don't say that because I want to take those things with us. It's merely the observation that the people who are most vocally against those are in favor of their opposites. And by opposite, I don't mean equality. I mean discriminatory in the opposite direction. You have a different opinion of cis-straight white men than you do other groups. Your envisioned future is not void of bigotry, but merely a future where bigotry is not referred to as such.
What's sad is that they are being left behind because they would rather hold on to those things I just listed than try to change. And change is difficult. It takes effort. But it also takes effort to vainly resist every step forward that society makes.
What better describes Steve? Someone who is open to change, or someone who is resistant to change? This is someone who insulates himself from people who do not share his ideas, who refuses to communicate with people who not only disagree with him, but follow people who disagree with him, who's been wearing the same hat, the same pen, adhering to the same video schedule and structure for years. Does anything about Steve indicate a willingness to change?
The deal is this, fellow white dudes, the future is coming. Just the same as it came for our parents and our grandparents. It's coming whether you like it or not. You can live in that future, or you can live in denial. The choice is yours.
Do not lecture me about denial from inside the bubble you've created for yourself. The bubble you've designed specifically to protect you from people who don't share your point of view. The bubble that protects you from all those dislikes, nasty comments, and mean tweets you would otherwise receive. The future is unavoidable. Now, who exactly is trying to avoid it? Whew. Well, if you've made it this far, I'd like to thank you for enduring this trial with me. I don't intend for this to be a shit on Steve channel, but he's a consistent source of good material, and there hasn't been anything else grasping my attention as of late. But I promise not to subject you to another dose of shives for at least another little while. Scout's honor. Just kidding, I'm not a scout.